Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tim Fortier. I'm the Communications Coordinator with New Hampshire Municipal Association. Good afternoon and Happy New Year. And thank you for joining us for this 2022 webinar series. This is the first in at least three webinars that we'll be presenting to our members. This is a 2022 legislative preview, Raise Your Hometown Voices. But I do want to bring your attention that we'll be doing a legislative halftime in April, a legislative wrap-up probably late May or early June. And then we always do our final legislative update at the Doubletree conference, at our annual conference at the Doubletree. And that will be November 16th this year. So thank you for joining us for this first of three webinars. And our today's speakers are Margaret Burns, our Executive Director. Good afternoon, Margaret.
Good afternoon, Tim. I was on mute.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Katherine, our Government Finance Advisor.
Good afternoon, Tim.
And good afternoon, Natch Greyes, our Government Affairs Director.
Good afternoon, Tim.
Just want to remind you that this video presentation will be put into a YouTube video recording. We hope that you'll take that link and the PowerPoint presentations that come with this presentation and circulate that among your municipal colleagues and friends who are unable to join us live for this presentation today. And with that, I'd like to turn the program over to Natch Greyes.
Well, thank you, Tim, and welcome everyone. Welcome to 2022. It's going to be a very interesting session, not only in the breadth of bills, but also kind of in the procedures and what's going on. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, and then we're going to turn it over to Margaret for a word from our executive director and some bills she wants to highlight. Then I'm going to tell you a little bit about what to pay attention to this week, because as you may or may not know, the House and Senate are meeting for the first time this week. That is tomorrow and Thursday. And then we're going to talk about some of the new bills for this session. And then I'm going to turn it over to Katherine to talk about some of the financial bills. So even though it's not a budgetary year, there are still financial bills that are coming up and going to be of interest. So this year is going to be very similar to last year, except it's going to be a little bit different too, in the sense that there's not as much that's going to go on that's going to be remote. But in terms of the bills, we're going to see basically the same thing. And of course, that makes sense, right? We haven't had an election, so we haven't had any sort of reshuffling of players yet. So a lot of the same people will still be in the legislature and they're going to have the same interests. But probably the major focus at the beginning of this session is going to be redistricting. We're not sure how much time that's going to take up. It's probable that sort of deals have already been done there, that's pretty much already set. But it's possible that's going to be something that we're going to see early on Wednesday. But that doesn't mean there aren't going to be big municipal bills. And that's really what we're going to focus on today. All of those things that are going to affect you, our members. And one of the things I do want to remind you, and probably the lesson that you can draw from 2021, is that last year turned out a lot better than we expected. If you went back and watched the legislative preview from the beginning of 2021, you'll remember Cordell was sighing and saying, this is going to be a terrible year. And then we had our legislative wrap up at the end, and we said, you know what, it was actually pretty good. And the reason it was pretty good was because all of you spoke up. We communicate with you not only through these webinars, but also our legislative bulletin. And we reach out over the course of the session as things affect your towns individually. And we'll see some of those bills today, some towns that are going to be more affected than others. And we'll point those out for you as well. But really the key is the communication you have with your legislators at that local level is really key to making sure that things go well for municipalities. And that's going to be key for making sure things go well this legislative year. So in terms of how to sign up to testify this year, that's going to be a little bit different. Last year, of course, was entirely remote. All the testimony was taken remotely at committee hearings. That's not the case this year. In the House, we do know that the entire House is not currently meeting at the Capitol. It's currently scheduled to meet at the Doubletree Hotel in Manchester on Wednesday through potentially Friday. And we know that committee hearings are likely to be streamed, but we haven't gotten 100% confirmation on that. But we do know that even if they are streamed, they're not going to be taking testimony online like they did last year. So if you want to testify, you have to go to the Capitol in person. You can, of course, always also email committee members or call them ahead of time. Note, of course, that that won't result in them necessarily discussing what you tell them at the committee. So your best chance of advocacy is to go in person and tell them what you want to tell them there. The Senate is a little bit different. They are meeting in Reps Hall instead of in the Senate chambers. That allows them to spread out a little bit more. We think that's probably the plan for the rest of the year, but that's obviously going to depend on what the House does, and we don't have an entire year plan yet for how they're meeting. As far as committee hearings, it appears they're going to have some streamed at least. That's what we're seeing in the digital calendar so far, but again, no online testimony. But in both cases, it's a good idea to check the calendar. We obviously know what's happening this week. But each week on Thursday afternoon or early Friday morning, a new calendar comes out for both the House and the Senate, and things are a little bit different. They have digital calendars now, which visitors to the website are steered towards. But one thing we noticed last year was that the PDF calendars sometimes had different information than the digital calendars, and the digital calendars would be updated the day before or so with the information in the PDF calendars. So I would strongly recommend that you go to the PDF calendars for now. There actually is a bill in place to make sure that, or a bill that has been filed to make sure both of those are being updated at the same time. I don't know if that's going to pass or not, but it certainly seems like a good idea, although not something that affects municipalities, so it's not something we are advocating on. With that, I'll turn it over to Margaret.
Well, thank you, Natch, and welcome again, everyone, to the official kickoff of the 2022 legislative session. As Natch noted, 2022 is again going to feature a concerning number of bills targeting and eroding local control. So that will continue to be a theme in the legislature and, of course, our focus in the legislature for the upcoming year. Advocacy from local officials is going to be critical. I know that we say it a lot. Natch has already said it this morning. We'll probably say it again before the webinar is over. NHMA's advocacy, of course, is critical, but a huge part of what NHMA does for you is to give you the information and to encourage you to speak out yourself, because hearing from local officials, hearing real examples and real situations in communities is crucial to helping support or defeat important bills in the legislature. Last year, I think it was maybe easier for municipal officials to engage because of the remote nature of the session. You didn't have to travel to Concord in order to testify. So we know that will be a little bit different this year. But of course, as Natch has said, advocacy does not just have to be in the form of testifying at a hearing. A letter to the committee, speaking to the committee members, and speaking to your legislators throughout the year is also very effective and critical advocacy. We also wanted to take a moment to note that 2022 means another legislative policy process is upon us. For our more seasoned municipal officials on the call today, you know what that is. For some of you who may be newer to NHMA or newer to NHMA advocacy, this is the process that NHMA undergoes to revise, revisit, update, or readopt the policies and principles that guide NHMA staff in advocating for our members. And of course, the key to NHMA's advocacy is that the policies and principles we advocate on are created and adopted by our members, not by NHMA staff. And so it is a member-focused process, which also means that we need members to volunteer to be part of that process over the upcoming year. The first thing you can do if you are interested, and we hope you are, is to volunteer to serve on a policy committee. There are 3 different committees, one focused on finance, one on infrastructure and related land use topics, and one on general governance and administration. If you have an interest in serving on a committee, which includes reviewing new policy proposals from members, as well as revising and reconsidering the current policies that NHMA has, please reach out to NHMA as soon as possible. Let us know that you're interested, or reach out and let us know that you have questions about what it entails so that we can answer them and hopefully get you to volunteer for a committee. Members, of course, can also submit policy proposals, which means that any NHMA member can submit a proposal to include in the upcoming legislative policy. So that is something too that can and should be discussed at the local level and can be submitted to NHMA to be considered by one of those policy committees. Ultimately, the policy process, culminates with the Legislative Policy Conference in September 2022, when members come together to vote to adopt those proposed policies that come out of the policy committee. So there are a number of different ways to volunteer. Please look out for our email announcements and other information about how to get involved and how to be engaged in the policy process so that we can have great member representation with the upcoming policy process. All right, so as Natch said, I wanted to sort of focus on just a few different bills here before I turn it back to Natch. One of our top priority bills for the session is House Bill 1033, which is essentially an anti-lobbying bill for public officials and government officials. House Bill 1023 would prohibit recipients of state or local grants or appropriations from using such funds for lobbying. In short, this is a bill that is intended to significantly encumber the ability of local officials to engage in the legislative process. This type of bill has been filed before. It's not a new concept. And in fact, in 2017, a very similar bill was filed and was defeated. But with the anti-local government sentiment being more significant, more prevalent in the legislature last year and this year, this is an extremely important bill not to lose sight of and to take seriously. And it will require advocacy from NHMA, other organizations that are like NHMA, as well as from local officials. This is a bill that really parades as a transparency bill, but the way that it actually functions is to really cut local officials out of the legislative process that they have the right to be part of and to engage in. It affects all sorts of organizations that have been created and formed by local officials for education and advocacy, including the clerks, the assessors, the police chiefs, the fire chiefs, the building officials, and the list goes on, because there are many different organizations that local officials have formed in order to better get their voice and information out there and to engage in the legislative process. So we're going to be looking to our members to testify, to speak to members of the committee, and to speak to their legislators throughout the process. Broadband will again be a topic of interest in the upcoming legislative session. So this is a little, first some bad news, now some good news. The broadband bills appear to be good bills. Next week on Tuesday, January 11th, there will be a hearing in Senate Finance on Senate Bill 273. This is a bill that would make sort of a modest adjustment to the Communications District chapter, RSA chapter 53-G, and would allow towns that are part of a communications district to appropriate money at a special town meeting, specifically to approve a bond for a broadband project at a special town meeting. Essentially, what it's allowing them to do is move a little more quickly in the process. If you're familiar with RSA 53G, the Communications District chapter, it first requires the towns that wish to form the communications district to all vote at their respective town meetings to enter into the communications district. And what towns are running into is that if they vote at an annual town meeting to form the communications district, they have to wait an entire year until the next annual meeting in order to put forth a bond for a broadband infrastructure project. So this bill would just allow them to move a little bit more quickly and to hold a special town meeting rather than waiting until the next annual meeting to put that broadband project forward. And this bill comes out of some towns reaching out to NHMA NHMA, letting them know that this was an issue they were running into when trying to form a communications district. And so it's a bill that we hope will pass easily because there is sort of an identified issue that is trying to be addressed. Senate Bill 395 would create a broadband matching grant fund. This allows municipalities and cell phone service providers to apply for broadband matching grant funds to upgrade local cell phone service to the standard necessary to support broadband and other advanced communication services. So we know that the pandemic only highlighted the lack of broadband or reliable broadband in various areas of the state. So we hope that these bills will remain front and center and pass this year in the legislature. Finally, before I turn it back to Natch, is some legislation to address the right to freedom from discrimination law. This is a bill that some of you may be familiar with. It started out last year as House Bill 544, which was generally referred to as the so-called divisive concepts law. House Bill 544 did not pass, but essentially a very watered down version of it was put into House Bill 2, the state budget trailer bill. And what the legislation does is it prohibits the teaching of certain topics related to age, sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, race, creed, color, marital status, family status, mental or physical disability, religion, or national origin. And it applies to employers, it applies to schools, and it applies to local governments as well. We opposed House Bill 544 and the inclusion of the language that became law in House Bill 2 for a simple reason. And the reason was that local governments should not be prohibited from making these decisions at the local level about what to teach, what to train their employees on, or what conversations or what kind of programs they should host and create for the public and for their communities. Additionally, some of the language in the legislation itself was pretty vague and pretty ambiguous, and therefore really leaves open potential claims against local government. And even more concerning, when the legislation passed, really made a number of our members feel concerned about whether they should continue with various programs or initiatives they had undertaken relative to diversity and equity. The language was vague enough that they were unsure whether the actions they were taken were prohibited by the legislation or allowed by the legislation. So Senate Bill 304 would repeal and replace this legislation with language saying that no public employer is prohibited from engaging in or requiring in certain types of training. And House Bill 1576 would simply repeal the right to freedom from discrimination law that is currently on the books. The first of these two bills hearing will be held next week on January 12th at 1:45. We really encourage any members who have undertaken any efforts in this area and the law has caused any issues or consternation with regard to those efforts. We really encourage members to either try to attend the hearing on Senate Bill 304 and speak out about their experiences, or to submit a letter to the committee about the bill. So that's all I have, Natch. I'll turn it back to you.
Well, thank you, Margaret. So as far as what to pay attention to this week, as I mentioned before, the House and Senate are meeting tomorrow, January 5th. The House is going to meet as well on Thursday, and the Senate will as well. But the House may also meet Friday, depending on how long their business takes and whether they finish everything that they want to finish. And the first thing that both bodies are going to do is they're going to take up the leftover bills. So bills that were saved from last year. These are the bills that went back to committee or were held by a committee, and they are now in the second year of the legislative session, and so they have to act on those bills. So that's what they're doing first. And one of the major focuses are going to be the redistricting bills, certainly in talking to legislators on an individual basis. That's what they've talked about quite a bit. That's really not going to affect municipalities too much because, of course, you're going to be doing the same thing you always do with elections. Your moderator is going to go oversee them, and everyone else is going to be involved. But there are a few bills here that we do want you to pay attention to. So there's a anti-fluoride bill, HB 611, which prohibits the introduction of fluoride into any public water system in the state. And for those of you not familiar with how the law works now, it's the most local option you could have. So you decide, your local legislative body decides whether to add fluoride or not, which of course is recommended by everyone who has studied dentistry as a way of helping prevent cavities. And so it's really this local decision. And for whatever reason, this bill, which is not the first time we've seen an anti-fluoride bill, but it's one of the few that have gotten as far as this one has gotten, in that it has come out with a positive recommendation to the House from the committee, would seek to undo that local decision-making process. So the municipalities with fluoride in their system currently are Bedford, Belmont, Concord, Derry, Dover, Durham, Goffstown, Greenland, Hanover, Hooksett, Laconia, Lancaster, Lebanon, Londonderry, Manchester, Madbury, Newcastle, Newington, Portsmouth, and Rochester. So if you're from one of those communities, it's a very good idea to reach out to your legislators, preferably today, and say, hey, we want to make this decision at the local level. This is something we should be allowed to do. Please vote against HB 611. Guns, a perpetually popular topic for all legislatures, not just the New Hampshire legislature. But HB 307 passed the House, and it's now awaiting action by the Senate. It went to the Senate Judiciary Committee, which took a long look at it over the summer and the fall, and has now recommended the bill to pass to the full Senate with an amendment. And that amendment is good in the sense that one of our major concerns was that the bill, as passed by the House, would allow someone to come on to municipal property and do whatever they want with their guns. They could use them, they could sell them, they could, possess them. This bill would prohibit municipalities from regulating possession of firearms, which is already the law. But the more concerning thing was the use of firearms, because we don't want people, showing up to town hall and just, on New Year's and shooting guns in the air. And that's pretty something that is not a great idea for a variety of reasons. And so understandably, municipalities should be able to regulate what happens on their property. And so this amendment would remove the word use. And so that would allow municipalities to regulate that. But there's another portion of the bill that has provisions that would result in the punishment of local officials who try to enact an ordinance that doesn't really comply with what the law is. And the law as it is now is that, if you enact an ordinance and it, for whatever reason, is superseded by state law or the Constitution, something which you often don't know until the New Hampshire Supreme Court makes a decision. I mean, that's the role of the court, is to decide what the law is and decide whether, a subservient law is superseded. So a state statute goes against the Constitution, or a local ordinance goes against the state statute or Constitution. That's what the court decides. What happens now is the court would just say, okay, this ordinance or this law would have no effect. And that's what it has always been in the history of the United States. That is what happens. This bill is different in that it would essentially punish local officials for making a decision that reasonably legal scholars could argue, look, until there's a decision by a court, it's possible this would not be preempted. It's reasonable. You could have town council write a letter that says, we don't think this is preempted, and you go to court and the court says, nope, town council is wrong. but you won't know that until the judge makes their decision. So that's very concerning. We are hopeful that either an amendment to remove this provision or just outright kill the bill, which would be a better option, would occur in the Senate. So that's something we are also urging you to contact your legislators about today, obviously your senators, since it's in the Senate. And I believe the last bill that I want to mention that's seen some sort of action occurring this week are the 11 forgotten qualifying projects bills. You may have heard us mention these a few times in other contexts. This is HB 398 and HB 412. And these are appropriations for water and wastewater projects that qualified for state funding, but were not funded. And so if we step back a couple years to 2020, what happened is these were qualifying water and wastewater projects. They would have received their share of the state funding under the program that exists for those, but there was a budget freeze ordered by the governor because we weren't sure how COVID was going to affect the economy, and we had huge unemployment. That happened. Thankfully, we've recovered mostly from that. But in the interim, these 11 projects didn't get funded. Last year, as part of the budget cycle, there was discussion about funding these, but unfortunately, some incorrect information was provided to legislators that they would be eligible for funding through ARPA, which is, of course, the federal funding, and they are not eligible because they were completed before March 3rd, 2020. So these are the 11 forgotten projects. They have no funding, but they qualify for state funding. So we're just looking to have the state live up to its promises. So the towns of Hooksett, Dover, Concord, Nashua, Exeter, Newport, Littleton, and Salem should be particularly interested in these. Certainly suggest that you urge your House members to vote yes to approve these two bills to provide that funding. And since I'm on water and wastewater, I will mention one bill that I didn't put in any of these slides. It's not coming up this week, but it's another wastewater bill, HB 1134, which is would set up a study committee to deal with the issue of the not actually flushable, but labeled flushable wipes, which is something that I know that a number of wastewater operators have been pushing for some time because of the costs associated with dealing with that problem in the wastewater system. And that's just one of a smattering of new bills this session. And as you might expect, we're going to see a lot of the same themes in 2022 as we saw in 2021. Largely, those aren't great for municipalities. Frankly, they're pretty bad, particularly when it comes to municipal authority and local control. There are a few good bills. So there are a few bills that are definitely going to be a positive change, and we're going to discuss a few of those. But many of the bad bills are quite devastating to municipalities in different ways. There are 960 LSRs, legislative service requests, which are basically a legislator goes in, asks the attorneys on staff at the legislature to write up the language for the bill. And it's kind of surprising this year because usually we end up following somewhat less than a third of those. But as we've gone through all of the new bills that have been filed, we've discovered that quite a few involve municipal issues. So we're following about half of those, I think. And so what we're covering today is really just a highlight. Some of the biggest bills that we've seen, but certainly just know that it's really important for you to subscribe to the legislative bulletin, preferably in electronic format, because the mail has been a little bit slow. And you can get that information electronically from us on Friday afternoons rather than Monday or Tuesday when it might be a little too late. And in the bulletin, we'll be highlighting the issues that come up, the bills that become big issues, as we always do every year, even though we have a new team, of course. So I want to make sure that everyone knows we're having a continuity of services here at NHMA. So some of the big bills that we are looking at is the short-term rental bill is one of the ones that we've received a lot of calls from our members, especially in the more tourist-rich areas of the state. And that's SB 249. It's a bipartisan bill with significant support in the Senate. It has quite a few senators who have signed on. And it would prohibit local zoning ordinances from prohibiting or even regulating short-term rentals, so Airbnbs and the like. And this is something that's currently decided at the local level. And of course, we believe it should stay that way. And based on all of the calls we've received, we know that you do too. And we strongly encourage you to talk with your senator about the importance of opposing this bill. It is something that has come up really in light of the fact that there was a Supreme Court decision a couple years ago that affirmed that, of course, a municipal zoning ordinance could regulate where short-term rentals are allowed in town. And we know that that information is not always communicated to people who are buying new houses, not through any fault of the municipality, of course, but you know, if you're selling a house, you want to present everything you can and leave out the things you can. So, you know, municipalities, especially in more tourist-rich areas, have seen a significant number of their housing stock being turned into short-term rentals, and that's caused significant problems, both in supplying the local economy with workers, as well as, you know, everything from people leaving out garbage by the side of the road instead of bringing it to the town facilities, and so it's getting tracking bears to you know, more significant problems with adding things onto houses that don't comply with the building code or fire code and unsafe buildings. So this is really something that's a pretty comprehensive issue, and we think that municipalities have a significant interest in ensuring that this statewide zoning regulation would be not take effect. HB 1073 would repeal an exemption that was added to the right to know law last year. And that exemption would clearly extend the attorney-client privilege to municipalities as well as other governmental agencies. There was a New Hampshire Supreme Court decision in the early part of last year that was subsequently withdrawn, which essentially subjected attorney information between not only municipalities, but other governmental entities to a privacy balancing analysis. So rather than being able to say, you know, we talked with our attorney and got advice about this, and then not having to disclose that advice would be subject to disclosure upon a right to know request, depending on how that privacy balancing analysis came out. That was obviously very problematic because it basically defeats the purpose of consulting with your attorney, because you know, one of the ideas behind the attorney-client privilege is that you ensure that you can get advice that protects you from liability, or advice if you know that there's some sort of liability that exists. And now if that advice can be disclosed to the world, you've just invited a bunch of lawsuits. So this very important exemption was added last year, and apparently wasn't liked by everyone. So a bill has been filed this year to repeal that exemption, and we are hopeful that that bill will be defeated. Changing gears a little bit to some election bills. That is a major focus this year. It is an election year. It is the year when redistricting happens, because of course the census occurred back in 2020. And so this is the session when that happens. So as always with this particular year, meaning a couple years out from the census. It is election bills are a highlight. It's something that gets examined in the whole electoral system. And there are a few really concerning bills this year. HB 1359 would prohibit any election official other than the clerk from performing election day duties when they appear on the ballot for any position. And so what that means for a position like a moderator is the elected moderator, of course, has a 2-year term. So every year that their name is on the ballot, they wouldn't be able to be there doing the role of the moderator for the time when their name is on the ballot. And you'd have to have a moderator pro tem for that day. And so essentially, you're looking at potentially having to almost double the workforce by finding all these people to fill in for municipal officials, depending on the exact election schedule for your municipality. It's a serious problem already. Getting enough people who are qualified to come work during the election, never mind having to recruit a whole bunch of new people because a few of those officials' names are on the ballot. And as I know, and all of you know, most of these positions are not something that are hotly contested. There aren't a whole lot of people in town who want to be town moderator. It's a pretty thankless job. So oftentimes, these aren't even contested positions. HB 1485 creates a recall procedure for any local elected official serving a 3-year term. It's kind of a strange bill in that it's very vague about what is allowed under this. So it says that no recall for an official performing a mandatory duty or for not performing any act that would subject that official to prosecution for official misconduct if done. So essentially, if they are required to do whatever it is they're doing, or they can't do something because it would be illegal and they could get prosecuted for it, you can recall them for any other reason. And that's going to be very complicated. It would require litigation in virtually every case because you'd have to have, assuming it's being contested, because you'd have to have a judge determine whether one of those exemptions apply. And you're also going to have this additional cost of the recall election for these positions. There are a couple more election bills as well. 1567 allows any registered voter to sue in Superior Court any municipal election official for failure to perform his or her election duties. If the voter prevails, that official will be removed from office and the municipality must pay the voters attorney's fees and court costs. But probably more disturbingly is there's nothing to stop someone from just making up some sort of allegation and filing suit. So, if Margaret's, an election official in her town and I'm a registered voter that doesn't like Margaret for whatever reason, I could just sue and say Margaret didn't do her job. And there's no penalty for me doing so. It just, wastes a whole bunch of money and time. And it's just strange. And then there's HB 1064. And that bill would prohibit the use of ballot counting devices. So, the ballot counting machines, all ballots would have to be hand counted. And I don't need to tell anyone who's in a municipality with a fair number of voters what a nightmare that would be. It's just going to be quite a nightmare. It's going to take days to count votes for offices, and I can't imagine that will gain a lot of traction, especially among the Senate and other offices that have quite larger districts. But it's hard to say, and it's definitely a bill we wanted to bring to your attention. There are, of course, a number of mask and vaccine mandates, as you've seen, I think, in every news source that covers New Hampshire over the past couple of days. There are quite a few bills. We counted early on, and there were 20 bills pertaining to vaccines and vaccinations, 3 related to masks and 1 related to local health officers. So it's a lot. And it's going to be a very hot topic this year. And it's going to be something that does affect municipalities. So certainly be paying attention to the bulletin as we keep you updated on that. There is one bill that I do want to highlight, which is that health officer bill, 1272, because I think it serves as a good illustration of the strangeness of some of the bills this year. So that bill would essentially limit a local health ordinance to being 10 days if there's no other authority that authorizes it. But it's not really clear, because under a local health ordinance currently, what happens is the health officer proposes the ordinance and says, you know, we have to do whatever to keep the bears out of the trash, and resulting in trash being spread around, or, you know, rats out of restaurants, or whatever the case may be. And then the select board votes on it, and it's not clear, you know, what this bill, who this bill wants to affirm, whatever this local ordinance is. And the other concerning thing is obviously not only the 10 days, but it has to be tied to a specific location. And so when we're talking about a lot of the things that local health officers deal with restaurants and, you know, pests and things like that, you know, we're not necessarily talking about specific locations or a very small, discrete period of time. It's obviously a serious health hazard that needs to be dealt with, because, you know, no one wants to go to a restaurant and eat there and then get sick. You know, that has to be dealt with, and it just doesn't make a lot of sense. But that's something that I think just highlights kind of the strangeness of some of the bills we've been seeing this year. We have the Housing Appeals Board jurisdictional bill. That's HB 1307. This is a bill that we did want to bring to your attention, because it's something that we know a lot of members have strong opinions about, and it's worth paying attention to, because it's probably worth going to the committee hearing to express those opinions. So if you haven't been paying a whole lot of attention, over the summer, the Housing Appeals Board, which is a new board, fairly new board, I should say, issued a decision that caused some concern. Essentially, it said it had the jurisdiction to deal with an appeal over select board's decision about whether to reclassify a Class 6 road as a Class 5 road. Now, of course, you'd think from the name Housing Appeals Board, and, you know, the fact that one of the originating statutes says it deals with questions of housing and housing development, that really the reclassification of a road would be outside its jurisdiction. But it said it was close enough, because there was a development that would be served by that road, that would qualify as something it could have jurisdiction over. And what we learned in light of that was even legislators who had supported the creation of the Housing Appeals Board saw that perhaps they had different understandings of the jurisdiction. And certainly we've seen that many people have a different understanding of the jurisdiction than the Housing Appeals Board itself, or at least we've heard from a number of members who are concerned about that case. So HB 1307 has been filed, and that would clarify the jurisdiction by essentially just limiting the Housing Appeals Board to overseeing appeals from final decisions of municipal land use boards on applications related to housing. And we're hopeful that there'll be an agreement that comes out of that about what the correct jurisdiction should be, and that's clearly spelled out in the statute. The last bill that I'm covering today is actually 3 different bills, and they involve remote meetings. There were several bills last year involving remote meetings, you may recall, and one of them, Senate Bill 95, passed the Senate unanimously. But the House was unwilling to contemplate any changes to the right to know law to allow municipalities and other governmental agencies more flexibility in having meetings in a remote context. So this year, there are 3 different bills, HB 1014, SB 322, and SB 344. And we are hopeful that some sort of compromise will occur that will give municipalities some more flexibility, because we've certainly heard from our members how important it is to have that flexibility in order to accommodate the desires of their citizens. And with that, I'll turn it over to Katherine.
Thank you, Nate. I appreciate that. Welcome, everybody. We are going to switch gears a little bit here and talk about some new financial bills that NHMA continues to follow as we consider fiscal impacts to local government. So as you're reading our bulletins or watching the news, perhaps, please consider the impact pending legislation may have on municipal budgets. Ultimately, the property taxpayers who fund those budgets end up with the burden. So we'll ask you over and over, consistent messaging to raise your voice and contact your representatives and advocate for the state to fully fund new mandates, which is part of the constitutional law in New Hampshire, to fix some broken promises where we have downshifting costs, and to adopt legislation that does allow for local decisions that results in positive fiscal outcomes. So it's really imperative that we continue to advocate for this shift in the way we're currently financing mandated increases, as our local tax dollars are already exceeding or perhaps maybe at our fiscal capacity. So efforts to communicate to the legislature the effects of legislation on our governments is going to be tremendously helpful, especially as we move into this session. So today I'm going to focus on a few bills that are on our radar. Some are good for our members and others have some negative fiscal impacts. So tax exemptions for right-of-way use. HB 1494 would exempt phone and cable companies from paying property taxes on their public use of right-of-ways that would otherwise be taxable under the RSA 7223. So for government-owned properties, such as when their poles, cables, and other equipment is located in the rights-of-way. So if this bill were allowed to take effect, the exemption would result in a significant reduction in property taxes paid by the telecommunications and cable companies. So while this would not necessarily affect municipal revenues in that we would just reallocate the dollars and increase property taxes to all taxpayers, it would certainly shift the burden to the local taxpayer. The amount of revenue lost could vary significantly depending on the municipality, so we do not have exact dollar amounts and we're not able to estimate the fiscal impact. However, we anticipate that it could be significant. And another thing to note for this particular bill is that the New Hampshire Supreme Court ruled in Verizon New England versus the city of Rochester in 2007 that it's unconstitutional to subject certain entities, such as a telephone company, in that particular case, to taxation under the RSA while not taxing other entities. So this legislation does directly conflict with that Supreme Court decision. The next bill that we'll discuss is some promising changes. So that's always some good news when we hear promising changes to the New Hampshire retirement system that are being proposed this legislative session. So this is a bill that comes back pretty much every year, and it's the Property Tax Relief Act of 2022, appropriately named. So HB 1417 is an NHMA policy bill that proposes to restore a portion of the state contribution to the employer share for teachers, police, and firefighters at 7.5%. So a wide variety of changes are being proposed, and there's 10 bills introduced this session that affect New Hampshire retirement. However, this is the most promising bill that we see, and we would encourage our members to reach out and support this bill, as the state contribution would be tremendously helpful. And while it's introduced and defeated every year, it would have significant positive fiscal impact. So the 7.5% contribution is certainly far less than the 35% share that the state originally promised, but it is estimated to be $27.7 million in fiscal year 2023. And well, at 35%, that would be 129 million. It would still provide some relief. So that is one bill that we encourage you to reach out and support. Another bill is working after retirement, which is introduced in HB 1079. And this would increase the part-time employment thresholds of the New Hampshire retirement system. So what this bill would do is increase the limitation of 26 hours per week that a current New Hampshire retiree can work for a New Hampshire retirement system participating employer, and it would increase it to 32 hours a week, or a total of 1,664 hours per year. This bill also would remove the 28-day waiting period from the effective date of retirement before a retiree can work in a part-time capacity for the same or another New Hampshire retirement employer. So we would support these changes, and particularly for our smaller municipalities that rely on these experienced retirees to fill these part-time positions. Other bills being followed this session that are retirement related would be HB 1590, and this would allow the employer to disaffiliate without paying its unfunded liability. So this is one of the more troubling bills that we're seeing, because employers could opt out of the New Hampshire retirement system only for municipal employees, not police, teachers, and fire, just the employees, by a vote of the legislative body. So the current law does allow a municipality to withdraw, but it requires that it pays its share of the unfunded liability. So as written, this would burden the municipalities that would remain in the system with the withdrawing, and that those municipalities would share the accrued unfunded liability. And the cost sharing contribution rates assume that current and future employees will continue to participate in the plan. So creating an unknown future fiscal impact for municipalities who remain would be the result if this legislation were adopted. So another concern is that based on shifting burdens to remaining towns, everyone could choose to leave the system altogether, and that would then increase rates for the remaining Group 1 and Group 2, teachers, police, and fire, into the system. So the bill doesn't really address how that would be handled. So I think that this would be a bill that we should all consider in opposition, and NHMA certainly opposes this bill. HB 1535 would provide a 1.5% cost of living or COLA adjustment to the New Hampshire retirement system retirees who have been retired at least 5 years by July 1st of 2023 and on the first $30,000 of their annual allowance. While we certainly know that there's inflation and we would like everyone to see a COLA, the retirement system does not have a built-in COLA plan, and its unfunded accrued liability, or OPEB, as do other state plans throughout the country. And when the COLA passed in 2019, you all have seen what took effect on July 1st of this year. And that was an additional unfunded liability of $78 million in fiscal year 2022. So that's the effect that you're seeing now of the 19.6% aggregate increase on your municipal budgets today. So the estimated impact of this bill would be $135 million in fiscal year 2024, $139 million in 2025, and $142 million in 2026. And it could even go further out. So this would have a huge impact on municipal budgets if we saw a 19.6% increase with a $78 million fiscal impact from the last COLA. So again, while we are not against COLAs for our hardworking retirees, we would have to oppose this bill unless the state decides that it's going to fund the costs associated with this COLA. Some other bills that we are following closely are related to vehicle registration fees. So House Bill 1570 would reduce vehicle registration fees collected by the municipality. So The revenue collected and retained from municipal vehicle registration fees are counted as revenue and unrestricted revenue. And while it is impossible to calculate the precise reduction that this would have, we did go back to 2019 and $289 million was collected in vehicle registration fees. And that we estimate an $80.4 million reduction based on House Bill 1570 if it were to take effect. So this calculation is not exact because we don't know make, model, and year. However, we do know it would have a significant impact on local budgets. Another bill that's positive for our local governments would be Senate Bill 437. And this would allow for a additional municipal fee for transportation improvements. It would actually increase the fee. So currently we have a $5 fee that municipalities can charge to put into a transportation improvement fund. This bill would increase that option, and it's a local option, to $15. So this fee is assessed at the time of the motor vehicle registration, and it's a local option fee that requires the legislative body to adopt it. So according to the information we have provided by Transport New Hampshire, as of 2020, 35 of our 234 municipalities, or about 15%, were known to have enacted this local option improvement fee, most at the $5 threshold, but several charging less than $5. So we do not have any data to show how much additional revenue this could raise. However, we do know this would increase local revenue for transportation if this legislation would pass, and that would be positive for our municipalities who choose at the local level to adopt this legislation. Other bills that we are following would deal with meals and rooms tax. This seems to come up quite regularly. So Senate Bill 315 would require that a portion of the revenues distributed to municipalities in meals and rooms in excess of 2021 amounts would be used to reduce the local property tax rate. So this bill, meals and rooms tax, is unrestricted revenue for our municipalities, and we maintain the position that these funds should remain under local control and should not have restrictions placed by a statewide mandate. So we would oppose this bill because the municipality should be able to use these funds at their discretion for their policy priorities. And that could in fact be to reduce the local property tax rate or to further some policy priorities. Another bill that we're following closely is HB 1204, which brings back the original version of meals and rooms from last session. So this version of the bill would go back to wanting a 7.9% meals and rooms tax imposed on restaurants, for example, and hotels, and increase the percentage from 30 to 40%. So House Bill 2 modified this version of the bill last year, and we have seen it being very beneficial to our municipalities in its current state. We'll be following this bill closely because it was a huge win for our municipalities last year, and we support any increase to municipal revenue sharing, but we are concerned that the tax itself that was at 9%, that just dropped to 8.5%, that would now be proposed to go to 7.9%, could in fact reduce the amounts municipalities are seeing, even with an increase in percentage, or perhaps the legislature chooses to drop the tax but not increase the percentage in revenue sharing to municipalities. So the creation of the dedicated fund, which also occurred, which has allowed us to receive more revenue based on actual income received from this tax and not estimated, is also not addressed in this bill. So it's something that we'll be following closely this session. And finally, a few other bills to mention. SB 338 is a positive bill. It would allow a municipality to collect an occupancy fee for the purpose of establishing a capital fund, a revolving fund, or a tourism support fund. So this bill would be a vote of the legislative body. It would be a fee collected of up to $2 per occupancy based on a 24-hour period, and the legislative body also would get to specify how many numbers of consecutive days the fee would apply to, and the maximum number of consecutive days is 184 that the fee could be collected. So this could be a positive fund for the purpose of augmenting the cost of municipal services associated with increase in tourism and transient traffic. Any funds received in this fund, as per the legislation, are not part of the general fund accumulated surplus, and they can only be expended for specific purposes. So we do support this local option and let municipalities decide if this would be beneficial to their individual community. And then finally, SB 239 is a bill that we are following because it would require that the DRA be notified when a municipal audit is completed and establishes a fine for non-compliance with these municipal audit requirements. So currently under RSA 21J:20, this bill would require, I'm sorry, not currently, but under the current RSA, the bill would require that not only do we complete our audit and report it, but there's a potential for a fine. So NHMA does not support any type of fines or fees associated with legislation that could impact a municipality. And while it's currently best practice and it is outlined in the RSA for the requirements of an independent audit, uploading it to the DRA or providing that information does it not in and of itself seem like it would be too heavy of a lift of a mandate, but the penalty level levied against a municipality is definitely not supported. So now I will turn it over to Tim to talk to us about some upcoming events.
Yes, thank you, Catherine. Great job, Catherine, Natch, and Margaret. You've certainly indicated there'll be no shortage of fun and excitement over at the State House this year. We do encourage you. This webinar is Raise Your Hometown Voices, and one way that you can do that to be kept informed is to subscribe to our legislative bulletin. It's on our website. You'll find it under Advocacy and under Legislative Bulletins, and then you will receive on a weekly basis between now and June, the legislative bulletin, which will tell you about everything happening over at the State House. If you could advance the slide for me. But in the meanwhile, we do have upcoming our 2022 Town and School Moderators Workshops, one on January 8th for Senate Bill 2 workshops and February 12th for Traditional Town Workshop. If you know your town or school moderator, please forward this information to them and ask them to register as soon as possible. Next slide, please. The do's and don'ts of electioneering. We have NHMA's Legal Services Counsel, Steve Buckley, who will review electioneering limitations on government. That will be Wednesday, January 19th, noon to 1. Next slide, please. And then Steve will also be doing the Right to Know for Law Enforcement hybrid workshop. That is scheduled for Thursday, January 27th. That's correct. We do have an in-person rate, that's $65. And if you wish to join us virtually, that would be $55. And I believe that's it. I don't know if there were any other, I did not see any questions, any other feedback from the staff before I thank you, our members, for joining us today. As you heard clearly, they need your help over at the State House. So we encourage you to get involved in the legislative policy process. We encourage you to reach out to your state representatives and state senators on those bills that we highlighted today, and we'll highlight to you in our legislative bulletin. So with that, I'd like to thank you again for joining us today. Thank you, staff, for a wonderful presentation, and Happy New Year.
Thank you, everyone.